All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our native shoreline workshop today. My name's Amanda Schmidt. You probably received an email or phone call or some sort of advertisement from me in the past month, and that's why you're here. So quick before we get started, I'm just going to go over the agenda for today. So the first presenter we have is Lynn Markham from UW-Stevens Point, and she's going to present on the science behind natural shorelines. Then we have Johnson's Nursery here. They're going to go over plant selections appropriate for shoreline restoration and conservation. Then we'll take a quick 10-minute or so break. And the final presentation will be from Paul Sebo from Washington County, and he'll go over some layout and design considerations, and then overviews of regulations and permitting for shorelines. So you might be wondering, if you saw my title, which is Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator, you might be wondering, why am I putting together a shoreline workshop? Kind of out of my wheelhouse a bit. But as with most things in lake ecology, yes, it's recording. So as with most things in lake ecology, shorelines and invasive species can be very interconnected. So natural shorelines, robust native shorelines can help prevent invasive species. So just super quickly, a couple reasons behind that. And I'm sure that Lynn is going to go into some of this in her presentation, so I won't spend too long on it. But one of the reasons shoreline plants can divert nutrients that fuel invasive aquatic plant growth. So if you think about runoff coming off of your lawn, that's going to get absorbed by those plants on the shoreline instead of going straight into the water and being food and fuel for invasive plant species in our water. Another thing, reduced risk for erosion. So again, if you have runoff coming off of your property and it's being kind of stopped and trapped by those shoreline plants, it's not going to be cutting into your shoreline, eroding your shoreline. So another benefit, and that lack of disturbance can help prevent invasive plants from establishing themselves. And then lastly, it provides biologically diverse habitat that could otherwise be open for invasive species. So if you have a really robust native planting at your shoreline, that space and those nutrients are going to be taken up and used by those plants, and they're not going to be available for invasive species to establish themselves. So that's my quick little plug for my program, and we will jump right into Lynn's presentation.
Technical, then one of the things as we're preparing for this, start to do some outreach and save the date kind of thing. We had a couple people reach out that says, hey, I live out of state during the summer, during the winter time. Could you make this virtual? So that's why it's also, so we have some people that are on virtual.
Okay, Lynn, you should be able to start presenting now. But you are muted, just so you know.
Sorry.
All good.
Now you can hear me and see me?
Yes,
okay.
Go for it.
Thanks. So my name is Lynn Markham. Thank you for having me today. I'll be talking about the science that Wisconsin has been studying for probably longer than I've been alive. They actually started studying lakes down in Madison around 1900. But I'm going to put together a brief summary with a bunch of graphics about what we know about how we can protect shorelines and how that protects the lakes, the fisheries, as well as other wildlife. So I'm a shoreland and land use specialist. I'm located at the Center for Land Use Education, which is at UW-Stevens Point, and I work statewide for Wisconsin Extension. So I work with all of the counties. I'll start with the land-water connection What we do on land affects the water because water runs downhill. So it affects the fish in a lake or a river. It affects the water quality. It affects what insects can live in the lake, which affects the fish again. And what's underwater is invisible to most of us most of the time. So I think one of our challenges is how can we show that connection between what we do on the land and how it affects the water and the fish. So one way to do that is to somehow be able to see underwater, to be able to see what's happening. For instance, if soil or fertilizer is washed off the land and into the lake, how does it affect the fish? How does it affect the plants? How does it affect the insects? How does it affect a lot of the things that we care about? So one way to see underwater is to go snorkeling, and I hope that some of you have had the opportunity to do that. It's really quite wonderful, but I realize not everybody's going to do that. So we've created some graphics trying to show this connection between land and water. So here's part of our graphic. And I would like you to spend a couple of minutes talking to the person next to you about what differences you see between the left and the right here. So what do you notice? And then why do those differences matter? So if you could spend a couple minutes talking about that, go ahead.
So I don't know if you can hear Lynn, but we have some good conversation going on here between folks.
Great. Why don't you make the call on it, Amanda, when it's enough, when it's wrapping up, or when, you know, we've got
Sounds
2
good,
or
sounds
3
good.
minutes.
Sure.
And then just feed me some of what you're hearing, or they can respond
Sure thing.
directly to me.
Mhm. Well, I guess, what are some of the things that you guys are noticing in Lynn's pictures here?
One on the left, there's a lot more plants.
One on the left has more plants, Lynn,
Yep.
and more fish, more vegetation, dead wood in the water, good habitat.
Mhm.
No driveway is another thing.
I think the one on the right. The one on the right also closer to the lake, therefore, I don't know if it is.
The house on the right is closer to the water is something that somebody noticed too.
Yeah.
Fertilizing.
Fertilizing the lawn. I do see some geese in there, so that's something.
Uh-huh.
All right, I'll turn it back to you, okay?
Okay. So actually, I would ask tell me a few more comments about, you told me what you noticed, but why do those things matter to you? And which lake would you prefer to live on?
We are getting overwhelming the left.
You want to live on the left, okay, because what do you like about the left?
Good fishing.
Good fishing,
Uh-huh,
Probably cleaner water.
cleaner water,
uh-huh.
nicer looking. But someone said you lose the view of the water.
Okay, so if you're in the house on the left, can you see the water out those windows?
Yes.
Okay, so you might not see every inch of the water, but you could see the water. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you. I always love to hear the conversation. So yeah, what we're trying to show here is that there is this link between what we do on the land and what ends up in the water. I'll just describe a little bit more, especially down near the bottom of the lake, part of it that we don't typically see. So on the left, you can see a sandy bottom. You can see some rocks. That's what all those little circles are. And the point is that the rocks didn't get buried in soil that washed off from the land, from the shoreline, that the shoreline isn't eroding. If you look on the right-hand side, this dark brown here is meant to signify an eroding shoreline. You have the runoff coming from the roof, eroding the shoreline, and that dark soil ends up down on the bottom of the lake. It covers a lot of the rocks. It covers perhaps any fallen wood, or there just plain is no wood because all the trees were cut down, so there's no source of wood. And that removes your areas for spawning beds. If spawning beds are set there, they get covered in silt, and therefore the fish eggs don't hatch. So that's part of it. And then part of it is, like you talked about, the clear water on the right versus the algae bloom, or I'm sorry, the clear water on the left versus the algae bloom on the right. That's partly due to the runoff and the soil that brings phosphorus with it. And that's also partly due to the lack of aquatic plants or water plants on the right. These lily pads that we see on the left help absorb nutrients from the lake and help hold the bottom of the lake in place. When those are removed, then we have more nutrients just floating around in the water, driving algae blooms. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Okay, we're going to go through some of the pieces here. So I created this as the value of shoreline zoning. It could also be the value of natural shorelines. They're pretty similar, really. So if we look on the left-hand side, that's an aerial view of this left-hand lot. When the house is set back from the water, set back at least 75 feet, that allows that space to keep the trees, bushes, flowers, grasses, native plants in place. On the right-hand side, where we have no shoreline zoning, the house can be built very close to the shore, like you pointed out. You know, maybe it's only 10 feet from the shore. And that doesn't leave space, especially when you think about construction equipment coming in to dig the basement. It doesn't leave space for those trees and shrubs and other native plants to stay there and stabilize the shoreline. We'll show in a little bit how trees, shrubs, and other native plants have very deep roots that help hold the shoreline in place. And that's not true of grass. Okay. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about the history behind how did we get to shoreline zoning? How did we get to trying to promote natural shorelines? Well, it actually comes from the Wisconsin Constitution, which says that our navigable waters are common highways and forever free. So this led to our understanding in Wisconsin that the waters in Wisconsin belong to all the people of Wisconsin. It's called the public trust doctrine. And shoreline zoning is a key tool in how we protect the public's rights, everyone's rights to navigable waters, to being able to swim and fish and enjoy the waters. From 1965 forward, in 1965, our Wisconsin legislature passed the Wisconsin Water Resources Act, and that included shoreline zoning. It acknowledged that the land closest to the shore has the largest effect on the lakes, and also that all the land that drains to the lakes and streams affects it. So healthy watersheds, watersheds with a lot of plants, a lot of forest, a lot of native plants leads to healthy lakes and higher property values. Wisconsin counties began administering shoreline zoning between 1968 and 1972. The purposes are to prevent and control water pollution, to keep our lakes swimmable, to protect our spawning grounds, our fish and our aquatic life, to keep it fishable, as well as frogs and other aquatic life, and to control our building sites where we place structures, and the land uses around them, as well as reserve shore cover and natural beauty. In other words, keep the trees and shrubs in place along the shoreline, because that holds the shoreline in place. Okay, so if we go back here, we're just going to kind of work our way down each side. When these hard surfaces like rooftops and like driveways, and you made a good point that we don't see any driveway on this left-hand side. I don't mean that these people walk from the road to their house. What I was trying to imply, but it's not obvious, is that the driveway is behind the house here. When they're built farther from the shore and the trees and plants are kept in place, the shoreline is more stable. It's not eroding away. And this allows for a number of things. One is high waterfront property values versus when we have algae blooms like this, we don't have as high of a waterfront property value. The studies have shown that when we have development that erodes the shoreline, this is an extreme case, this came from Manitowoc County, we have reduced property values. This is outlined in this publication, Protecting Your Waterfront Investment. If you'd like a copy of this and don't have one, I can get some down to Washington County. And clear water depends on where are hard surfaces located and how many hard surfaces do we have. It also depends on keeping those deep-rooted plants in place along the shoreline so that the shoreline can't be eroded like we see here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the hard surfaces. Hard surfaces are also called impervious surfaces because the water can't soak through them. So again, we're talking rooftops, we're talking driveways, we're talking garages, we're talking some patios and porches. The water can't soak through. If you think about an impervious surface like a patio, from, for instance, a frog's perspective, it's pretty much like a desert. The same would be true of a rooftop or a driveway. There are no plants growing there, so there's no food, and there's also no shelter. There's nowhere to hide. There's no place to get water. There's no place to get food. So these are barren areas and areas where wildlife is very susceptible to being picked off by some predator. If we think about fish and what fish need in order to survive, we can think about two different parts of it. One is the physical structure that fish need, their habitat. So they need aquatic vegetation, aquatic plants. They need woody habitat like these down trees. They provide safety for the smaller fish. And they need a clearer substrate. You see here the gravel, the rocks. Many fish, when they lay their eggs, they need this clear gravel or rock so that when their egg settles down, it's still going to get oxygen. It's not covered in muck and it doesn't get covered by soil coming off an eroding shoreline. So what contributes to this physical structure, having the aquatic plants and the down trees that fish need for their housing, their structure? It's what happens right along the shoreline. Are people leaving the aquatic plants in place? And are they leaving the trees and shrubs in place or replanting them so they can provide the habitat? When we look at the water quality that fish need, clear water so predator fish can see, clear water that doesn't have a bunch of sediment coming in and algae growth happening. And also, if we keep the nutrient levels down and the soil levels down in the water, then we have better oxygen levels, which fish need because that's what they're breathing. The water quality depends on the entire watershed. What's happening throughout that watershed? It can be urbanization, roads, driveways, houses, garages that are going in and driving water quality, more runoff, more pollutants getting into a lake or stream. It can also be agriculture and other land uses. Agriculture isn't all the same. If it's perennial agriculture, maybe an apple orchard or a hay pasture that has roots in place all the time, it's holding the soil in place quite well. If it's a plowed field, especially if it's plowed more often, that's going to have more runoff going to waterways. Fish are indicators. Healthy lakes and rivers have lots of different fish species that occupy different niches. Less healthy lakes and rivers have fewer or no fish species. Okay, speaking of fish, I would like you to pick one of these 6 fish for this next exercise. So we've got the Iowa darter, the Johnny darter, the brook stickleback, the northern pike, the black crappie, and the largemouth bass. So pick one of those in your mind, and you're going to be that fish for this exercise, and we'll see what happens as things on the land change. So the question we're going to look at is, how does our footprint on the land impact fish? And I'll let you know that the results that I'm going to show you from this exercise are based on a study of 47 warm water streams and 164 lakes in Wisconsin. So let's say that someone owns a waterfront lot. Here's the lake down here, and here's the road. It's a treed or wooded lot. And the question is, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to leave it as it is? Are they going to change it? Are they going to build a house, a driveway? What are they going to do with it? So let's say somebody decides they're going to develop the lot to some extent. They bring in a logging machine and they start cutting trees off the lot. They're cutting trees where they plan on putting a house and where they plan on putting a driveway. Okay, then they bring in the bulldozer and they clear out this area, they level it out, they get rid of any divots, which means that the water runs more easily across this and probably toward the lake. They put in a driveway and a house. They have a fairly small footprint, and it's a ways back from the lake. It's not close to the lake. If we measure what percentage of the lot is hard surfaces, the rooftop and the driveway, it's 7%. So the question is, what does this do to the fish that live down in the lake? How much runoff is there from this house and driveway? And does it make it to the lake? And does it carry pollutants with it? And how does that affect the fish? Any guesses? Okay, I'm not sure if you answered or not. I couldn't hear.
They say not too much.
Not too much. Okay, thank you. And they're exactly right. When our footprint is relatively small, our footprint on the land is relatively small, they found that all the fish in the study survived footprints of this size throughout the watershed that drains to a lake or a stream. So we can have homes along the shoreline, I should say homes a little way back from the shoreline, and lots of fish if we build carefully, if we keep our footprints small. Okay, now let's change it up a little bit and look at another lot that initially looks the same. But let's say somebody else gets a hold of this lot and they cut a few more trees. And when they bring in the bulldozer, they bulldoze a little bit bigger area. And they put in a longer driveway, somewhat bigger house that's a little bit closer to the water. So their footprint is bigger than the last one. It's 10% impervious, and it's a little bit closer to the lake. When the fish biologists went in and looked at what fish were in these lakes and streams, what they found is these fish were gone. So if you chose Iowa darter or black crappie, I'm trying to remember what else was on the list I gave you, maybe perch, those were eliminated, as were the rest of these fish. Brook trout are gone if we have this much impervious surface. So we start losing some of our fish species when 10% of the watershed is impervious, is what the researchers found. Okay, but for some people, they feel, for whatever reason, that 10% isn't enough, and they build larger. They build that garage, a sidewalk, a larger house closer to the lake. The footprint in this situation is 15% impervious. And I think you can probably guess what's going to happen. We lose more fish because there's more runoff and more pollutant, including soils, eroded soils, going to the lake. The fisheries scientists found that when we were at 15% impervious, this is the list of fish that were eliminated. So in addition to the fish that we lost last time, now we've also lost northern pike, largemouth bass. So I think we've lost a good number of the fish that were left. And let me just mention, if you like this fish game and you maybe want to use this fish game with another group, let me know. We do have some setups of it I can send you. I'm going to talk about the runoff and the pollution that goes with it, and then I'll get back to a summary. Maybe some of you still have your fish surviving. There's at least one of those 6 that's still surviving, so we'll get to that. What we found in Wisconsin is when we have undeveloped waterfront lots, like shown here on the left, we have just a little bit of runoff, phosphorus, and sediment going to the lake. When we have a light level of development, we start seeing an increase in the amount of sediment, but when it's back from the water and it's got somewhat of a buffer here, the water and the phosphorus runoff stays the same as an undeveloped lot. And when we have a large level of development, and especially when we channel the runoff right down the middle to the lake, then all the runoff from this roof and whatever driveways are around that might also be channeled this way carry 5 times as much water to the lake, 6 times as much phosphorus, and 18 times as much sediment. So what we do on the land, how big our footprint is, has a huge effect on what goes to the lake. Going back to the fish study, at less than 8% impervious, we have a large number of fish and a large number of fish species. When we get to that 10%, between 8 and 12, we lose this top group of fish. And when we go greater than 12%, then we lose the top group plus the middle group. Does anybody have the brook stickleback? Did anybody choose that fish? Okay, can't quite tell. All right. So the brook stickleback is one of these 5 fish species that survived. Some fish species are harmed by a number of things that are happening with increased impervious surface. The fish species that remain can typically deal with muddier water as soil has been washed in. They can also deal with warmer water. Because driveways, rooftops are going to increase the temperature of that water. The brook stickleback is a fairly small fish. It's not easily overheated. It can deal with somewhat warmer water temperatures. Not all these fish can. And it kind of has a superpower. And that is if the water quality gets poor enough that it can't get enough oxygen breathing water like fish usually do, it can come to the surface and breathe air for a short period of time. So that's one of the ways it's able to survive these higher levels of impervious surface. Okay, we had a 2008 study of lakes in Wisconsin that found this same trend: more impervious surface, fewer fish. And just to let you know what our current regulations allow for impervious surfaces, so we know that at greater than 12% impervious, we've reduced the number of fish significantly. Our current standards allow 15% impervious on all home or residential lots. and 40% impervious on commercial and industrial lots. So we allow pretty high levels of impervious surface right now. Probably not helping the fish on those higher levels. More impervious surfaces impact fish in a number of ways. They cause larger and more frequent floods, and they result in less groundwater. Less groundwater leads to lower stream flows and warmer water. We know that the asphalt gets hot in the summer, and when water runs across that and then to the lake, it's going to be warmer water. Thinking a little bit more about that temperature, we know that northern pike and walleye are both cool water fish, and we know that more impervious surface leads to warmer water. In the summer of 2012, a number of lakefront residents from around the state were calling DNR during a hot spell because they were seeing dead northern pike floating up to the top of their lake. The DNR sent staff out to check into this. They collected water samples. They analyzed those water samples for common pollutants like fertilizer or gasoline, and they didn't find those things. What they did find, people were not happy. They wanted the DNR to fix this. They didn't want to see dead fish. They didn't want the fish dying. So what temperature is lethal for northern pike? It turns out that it's 84 to 86 degrees. And when they measured the surface temperature of some of these lakes, it was 90 degrees. So it was the warm temperatures that were killing the fish, the warm water temperatures. Not enough oxygen anymore for the fish, because we know higher water temperatures lead to lower oxygen levels. Can the DNR fix this? Can they fix the water temperatures? When I ask younger students this, sometimes they say, well, just bring the ice trucks. But there isn't enough ice to cool down our lakes. So really, this is a question of what we do on the land and how much the water is going to heat up. Part of it is impervious surface and the runoff from that, because you can think of groundwater, the water that gets to soak into the ground, like an underwater refrigerator. It's 50, 60 degrees, not a real cool refrigerator, but nonetheless much cooler than on land. It gets that water nice and cool and then discharges it into lakes and streams slowly over the course of the summer. If you've ever been wading or swimming in a lake or a stream and you feel a cold pocket, that's probably where the groundwater is coming into the bottom of the lake or stream. Sometimes you can see it as a small spring under the water. You can see the sand particles moving, and that's kind of cool. But that's what groundwater can do to keep water cool. The trees around the edge of the lake and stream can also help a lot by shading the water, keeping it cool that way. This is the map of counties that had lakes with northern pike kills in 2012 due to those high water temperatures. So you can see Washington County was one of those counties. Perhaps some of you there saw these fish kills. I don't know. So like we talked about, the DNR can't really fix these lakes. If we want the northern pike and other cool water fish to survive, we need to limit the impervious surfaces, try to get the runoff from those impervious surfaces to soak back into the ground using rain gardens and infiltration trenches. Yeah. Okay, some of the other ways that impervious surfaces impact fish. When we have more runoff, more sediment, more soils being washed into the lake, that leads to algae growth, and that makes it difficult for some predator species that hunt by sight to find their food. It just makes it harder for them to find their lunch. And then, like we mentioned earlier, those sediments can also cover spawning beds. This particularly impacts fish like walleye because walleye lay their eggs and then just swim away. They don't stay and guard their nest and fan off their eggs like a bass or a bluegill would. So if their eggs get covered in sediment, in silt, they're not likely to hatch. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the trees and native plants along the shoreline as shown here on the left, but not on the right, and how that leads to less algae growth. Some of our suggestions in order to keep those trees and native plants in place is to build homes and other structures far back from the lake. That's to allow space for trees and shrubs along the shoreline. It's also to keep your investments safe. We know that in recent years, we've had increased flooding and high water levels. Building, rebuilding, expanding buildings close to the shore could be a very poor investment due to those changing water levels and the collapsing banks. What might be dry land this year, a few years later, may be underwater if it's close to the shore or if it just doesn't have much vertical difference between the water level and where you're building. Also, if you own a structure close to the water, I would suggest looking into flood insurance. You can purchase flood insurance even if you're not in a floodplain. It is available, and I can give you links to that if you're looking into that. Okay, so in terms of holding the shoreline in place, I hope maybe you've seen this before. If not, I think it's a great graphic. So this shows the roots of native plants. They can be 5 to 15 foot deep versus the bluegrass on the left, which is only 1 to 2 inches deep, the roots are. So these native plants can simply hold much more soil in place. By holding the soil in place, they're also holding the phosphorus in place. They're not having that soil wash into the lake or stream and take the phosphorus with it. We know that 1 pound of phosphorus can result in 500 pounds of algae growth. When those shoreline trees and native plants, the buffer, are removed, then we end up with eroding shorelines. It's a mess. It's bad for the lake. It's bad for the property owner. We get added water that can destabilize slopes from our rooftops, driveways, patios, and also septic systems that are built close to the shoreline. It's water, seeping out of a septic system. That's how it works. And that can also destabilize the shoreline. So you want septic systems, septic system replacements as far back from the water, both so that they're stable, as well as so they're not feeding nutrients into the lake. We want to minimize erosion and fertilizer use. When we do testing around Wisconsin, many, in fact, most of our lawn and garden soils contain adequate and often excessive levels of phosphorus. So when we have eroding shorelines, we're fertilizing the lake. It's that middle number on a bag of fertilizer that's your phosphorus. So you want to look for 0 as the middle number. 1 pound of phosphorus can result in 500 pounds of algae growth. And we did have a law passed here in Wisconsin. It was in 2011, I believe, that said you can't apply fertilizer containing phosphorus to lawns unless you qualify for one of the 2 exemptions. The exemptions are either it's the first year you're growing a lawn, there is some phosphorus allowed at that point. The other exemption is if you have a soil test that shows that your soil is low in phosphorus. That's very rare, but a soil test can tell you what the situation is. Okay, so what can buffers accomplish if they're big enough? This is a summary of 52 buffer studies done in the US. It found that in order to control nutrients, you need a buffer somewhere between 13 feet wide and 140, depending on slopes and soils. In order to control fecal bacteria, this would be from goose poop, dog poop, whatever, you need a buffer that's pretty big, between 76 and 300 feet deep, in order to keep the bacteria out of the lake. Sediment control, to keep the spawning beds from getting covered in sediment, 10 to 400. And wildlife habitat, a very large bar. Our current standard is at 35 feet for a buffer. So you can see that this helps, but is not sufficient in many cases. It's clearly not sufficient to keep fecal bacteria out of the lake. In most cases, it's also not sufficient to protect the spawning beds and keep the nutrients out of the lake. So larger buffers are better. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the wildlife. How do more trees and native plants lead to more fish and frogs? So when we have no buffer at the shoreline, you can imagine the fertilizer and or soil getting washed down this slope, coming into the lake and driving algae and aquatic plant growth. This leads to fewer fish because it's harder for the predator fish to hunt by sight. And like we talked about earlier, erosion covers the spawning beds, smothering eggs of walleye and other fish. From a frog perspective, frogs along this shoreline have no shelter. They're easily picked off by a great blue heron or other predator. Some of the hawks eat a lot of frogs. So yeah, just lack of shelter along the shoreline. Compared to, in this situation, you have all these deep-rooted plants to help hold the soil in place, as well as provide shelter for the frogs initially along the shoreline. And then when the trees fall in, the habitat, the fish sticks that the fish need, especially the smaller fish, to survive being eaten by the larger fish. Okay, so in conclusion, shoreline zoning standards make it possible to carefully develop a waterfront property, stabilize shorelines, protect the lake or river, and keep the waterfront property values high. When we don't have shoreline zoning, or it's not sufficient, we can end up with eroded shorelines, degraded lake or river in terms of water quality, as well as fisheries, so fewer fish and reduced waterfront property values. And just to give you a little summary of what's all included in shoreline zoning standards, we talked about the buffer area, the 35 feet closest to the shore, where most of that area is kept in trees and shrubs. There's a 35-foot viewing and access corridor shown here in the middle. The setback for homes and most other buildings is 75 feet back from the water. There's also a minimum lot size of at least 100 feet wide and a total lot area of 20,000 square feet, which is about a half an acre for unsewered lots. Smaller lots are allowed if they're sewered. There is a height standard of 35 feet. We talked about the impervious surface standard of 15% for residential lots, 40% for commercial and industrial lots. And there are also limits on structures near the shore, expanding them, and filling and grading. I sent Amanda this document here. It includes some videos about shoreline zoning and natural shorelines. I'm not sure if they arrived yet, but I also sent some handouts that look like what we've been looking at, this value of shoreline zoning. If she doesn't have them now, she should have them fairly soon. I ask you to think about how you might be able to use this graphic, the handout or the poster. It comes in 2 different sizes. A few possibilities that I've considered and some people have moved forward with The posters are meant for public locations where more people can see them. So this might be a town hall or county office, a community center, a senior center. It could be waterfront restaurants or schools. The handouts can certainly be used in Lake Association, Lake District newsletters. They could be used for placemats at restaurants and handed out by realtors or developers. And then just other ways it can be added, put together as part of a newspaper article. One gentleman from up north did that. I could send you that if you're interested. And on your Shoreline zoning resources page, whoops, shown right here, there is a link to the video of this piece right here too. There's a 3-minute video of it that you can look at. Okay. So just as something to wrap up with, to kind of put together what we've been talking about, imagine that you are this baby northern pike, that you live in the lake, and I want you to think about how well you're going to be able to survive depending on what shoreline you live along. Okay, how do you think you could survive as a fish along this shoreline? And Amanda, if you can help me out again here in terms of what people are saying, do you think you can survive, and why or why not? Those are my questions, basically.
I'm getting no's.
Okay.
There's no cover,
Mm-hmm.
no food source, no native plants.
Mm-hmm.
The house is too close to the water.
Okay. Yep. So you're going to have a lot of runoff going in. Yeah. Those are all great answers. Okay. Let's look at a different shoreline. The closer a building is to the water, we know the more it hurts fish. And also the larger it is, the more it hurts fish. What the best thing we can do in this sort of a situation is try to capture some of that runoff, which could be tricky, and get it to soak in through a rain garden. How about this situation? How do you think you would do as a small fish along that shoreline? Would you survive?
Lots of no's. Too much phosphorus.
Yep.
No trees, no natives.
Mm-hmm.
The fertilizer has too much phosphorus.
No,
Someone saying the jet skis probably disturb the fish.
Mm-hmm. Again, that's all good. We do know that jet skis and power boats can churn up the water 8 feet down, 8 to 10 feet down. So yes, if this is shallow here, which it probably is for at least a little bit, we know that that can churn it up. Obviously, we've got a big rooftop here, so we could have a lot of runoff there. You totally hit on the fertilizer. This is a common type of fertilizer, 10-10-10 if you go to the hardware store. And that middle 10, yes, is the phosphorus. The color of this grass suggests to me that it might be fertilized. Also, another thing to keep in mind is when we're mowing grass, once a week, we're usually compacting it both in mowing and, if you've got a lot of foot traffic on it, that can compact it. And again, it makes it harder for the water to soak in and more likely that it's going to run off. Yep. Okay. Who thinks you can survive as a small fish along this shoreline?
The people love this one.
What do you like about it?
Lots of vegetation, no runoff or little runoff.
Mm-hmm.
The house is set back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a huge improvement over the last couple that we saw for exactly the reasons that you provide. Yeah. And then I've got one more for you. How about that one?
They say that's the best.
Okay, why?
The house is really far back. There's lots of vegetation,
Mhm.
variety of vegetation too. The path out to the pier is just grass. It's not impervious.
Mhm.
Native plants in the water.
Mhm.
Someone said, no high-powered motors, just a canoe, it looks like there.
Okay, yeah, yep. One of the questions I like to ask is, if you're that small fish swimming under these lily pads, what do you think it's like for you?
Yummy, safer, shaded.
Exactly. Yep, it's everything a little fish could ever want. It's like an unlimited buffet and you're hanging out in the shade. Yep. All right, great. With that, I would like to thank you for joining me today. Thank you for having me today, Amanda. And if you have any comments or questions, I am happy to talk about those.
All right, thank you so much, Lynn. I really personally enjoyed this presentation, and I'm sure that other people did too. Does anyone have questions for Lynn that I can relay through the computer, get an answer for you? Um, the flow chart looking one? Yes, so she did, I guess I'll say she did send me some copies of those. They're just still in the mail, I believe. So if you're interested in that, if you have my email, just shoot me an email and I can get you a copy of that when those get here.
I'll just add to that, Amanda, if somebody wants a bunch of those for their group, they can contact me or you, and I can get you, if you want 20 for your group or 50 for your group, however big your group is, we have lots of the handout size.
Okay, great. And her information is up there too. Yep.
By watching the song, right?
Mhm.
And so what they allow, how many teams that, that they do on the line. Okay. The resource.
So I'll just repeat that. I'm not sure how much the microphone is picking up. So this is more a question for people here, Lynn. The question was, how do we get those zoning regulations changed within Washington County and the way that we zone things? And I'll actually let you answer that because I do not have an answer for you.
Lynn, this is Paul Sebo.
Yeah.
Not sure if you can hear me there too, but so the shoreline zoning in Washington County is actually a state regulation that the counties have to administer. So we cannot be any more regulatory than the state. The state passed the rule back in 2016 that basically said uniform standards. So that goes for erosion control, stormwater, shoreline zoning, and a lot of the state regulations that are passed down, which means said we can't be any more restrictive than what the state has. Across the whole state,
Paul?
the shoreline zoning are all the same. Yeah.
Paul, can I,
Right, and that's pretty much changed, like Paul said, by state mandate. Prior to that, township had, and township, I don't think the deal would have to. Because they're the ones that all, like they want, reality. Statewide mandate. Delivery. Houses on the floor. Their hands are against the side, quite difficult for them. They are appropriate here and a lot of it. But the only thing I'll challenge you on that though is you say it should be at the township level. But the township is only regulated as well as the flavor of the town, zoning or the town administrators, the town supervisor. So if you got a turnover of your town supervisors that want the Wild West, as you kind of put it, yeah, they would change the regulation of that township and, and that's the way some of the zoning laws end up getting changed. And I'll touch on one of those in my presentation later. It's like through the legislative, through the budget process, they throw in zoning changes, and rules get adopted into a budget process that then it shows up in the zoning laws. And a great example of what that is, a little bit later on, but
Paul, could I add one bit?
absolutely.
I was actually just talking yesterday to Katrina Shankland. She's a representative from Central Wisconsin. And last legislative session, she introduced a bill. It was AB 1110, I believe, that would give local control back to counties, not to towns, for shoreline zoning. So that if you wanted to have, for instance, a different setback or a different impervious surface limit, that counties could do that. And we did have a lot of counties who did it in the past. It was around 50 counties who chose for their most sensitive lakes and streams to have higher standards to protect them. So this bill would change it back to that way, the way it was prior to 2016, like Paul was saying. I will be giving a talk somewhat similar to this, and I think it will include a summary of that bill at the Lakes Convention, which is in April in Stevens Point. Also, if you want a copy of the bill from last session, Katrina is working on a similar bill for this session. You can contact me and I can send you a copy of what she proposed last session.
Well, Lynn was kind of talking about it. We used to have a lake classification that if we had a good quality lake, your setbacks had to be 100 feet tall. That 2016 rule eliminated that. Now it's great to be at the whims of the politicians that, hey, now we want it back in. We don't know, all things change. So no, that's what we administer at the office. But, I was not in my position at the time, but I don't know, Lynn, if you could confirm if it was Act 41 or.
It was Act 55. I believe it was passed actually in 2015.
Who's responsible for? So Washington County is the Land Conservation and Zoning Office. So I'm the Conservation and Zoning Manager. Let's all do a little bit of talk later about some of the shoreline standards. But yeah, we did.
So it seems like. That was at the bar, how do you want to say, these lakes should go well, we saw someone right out of the water already.
Right.
With new standards, you're not gonna tell them.
Right, and we can enforce future, but also within the shoreline standard, and the shoreline code and the requirements that come down, state statute, administrative code that come down into county ordinances. If we're an urbanized lake like we are, our limit is now 30% impervious, and you can go up to 40% as long as you treat kind of that difference from 30 to 40%. So even though Lynn mentioned the 15%, most of the lakes in Washington County are actually at a 30% impervious level.
Mm.
But I mean, Lynn, I'll even ask you this question. So you mentioned that, once you hit over that 15% and the development really kicks in, you lose all these fish. Now, in Washington County, I know a lot of our lakes have all the species that you kind of mentioned, in your presentation. So is it they're eliminated or just that they're in limited numbers because they can't, actively proliferate and, spawn
Sure.
and survive in certain areas of the lake, but they can in others?
Sure. So what I showed, Paul, that's not necessarily true for one lake. That was what they found overall in their study. That's the percentages that fish disappeared at. You would expect to see more impact from impervious surfaces if you're talking a seepage lake where once a pollutant gets in, it can't get out. If it's a drainage lake where pollutants can flow in and out, it might have less of an impact. It's also going to depend on the habitat in that particular lake. We do know that some of the lakes that have been studied in depth, some of them are near Madison, Lake Ripley, I don't believe is in Washington County, but kind of down in your part of the state. They're seeing loss of some of those species as well. So it depends on everything that's happening within a lake. Impervious surface definitely has an impact, but so does, down trees, aquatic plants, whether you have invasives, those all contribute to whether fish species disappear or not. Different species are susceptible for different reasons, like we talked about, temperature, being able to see your prey, your eggs getting smothered, and other reasons as well. Who's going to eat you?
With all that point up, it seems to me, I don't know if this is done, but 12% so above that. But a lot of the lakes are here. North Fall, some totally native plants in other areas. So it was still have to fit. So I'm wondering how they
Like in the study you're asking?
yeah, in the study, I mean, 12%.
Mhm. So the question is about the study and
Mhm.
saying, there's parts of lakes that have a lot of plants, there's parts of lakes that have more impervious surface or what have you. So how was that kind of considered? Was it like an average with the study that they did?
There are actually 3 different studies. The first 2 were done on streams. And then the third one was done on 164 lakes. They were looking at the entire watershed. They weren't just looking at one shoreline or another shoreline. When we're talking about how it impacts fish in terms of covering their spawning beds, I think it's very dependent on that particular shoreline that your nest is near. When we're talking about water quality and being able to see in order to get your prey, well, all the water that comes into the lake is bringing phosphorus with it. Some of that will get locked up down below, but that phosphorus is feeding the entire lake because water moves. So I think it depends on which factor in terms of how much it's tied to that specific shoreline versus how much it depends on the entire lake. But it's a great question.
All right, any other questions for Lynn? Yeah.
When you mentioned the jet skis and other motorized craft affect the water clarity 8 feet down, is there anything that the DNR is looking into as far as putting time-wise, or anything they're doing to limit time-wise, or some lakes that maybe it just wouldn't be feasible on a
Did you hear that question, Lynn?
I heard it was about disturbing the bottom with jet skis and power boats.
Yeah, so the question was whether or not DNR is planning on doing anything to limit, it was time, right? The time spent on jet skis, powerboats, something like that in certain
Okay.
water bodies.
Not that I'm aware of. They did a bunch of research on this topic a few years ago, and my understanding is the regulation of hours or speeds or boat size, I'm sorry, it would be speed, it would not be motor size, is regulated by towns. So they make those calls on recreational issues. They sometimes work with the DNR wardens to try to get some enforcement of those rules, but my understanding is it's decided at the town level. And if this person is interested, I can send, there's a book that talks about recreation and recreational regulation. And also I can send some information about those studies that were done if that's of interest.
Okay, that sounds good. Anything else at all for Lynn? All right, so with that, I will say thank you so much again for this presentation.
Sure.
You're welcome to hang around on here or leave or whatever you prefer.
Okay.
But we will move on to our next presentation at this point,
Okay.
which is going to be from Johnson's Nursery. So I don't know, do you guys want like a 5-minute break, or you want to just keep chugging through preferences? Keep going? All right, so we will go straight into your presentation then. So thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, we do have some stuff over there if you guys are interested. We can turn them all off. It's still pretty bright in here. We could try it. Yeah, let me go do it quick.
I was gonna. Feels better to you? Yeah, sure. I think that's better. You guys aren't here to see me. You're here to see the plants.
I think you should be in view of this camera.
It's a camera. Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody. That was a very interesting first presentation. I think it meshes perfectly with what I'm going to be talking about here today. We all heard the doom and gloom about what lawns can do and how close your house can be to the water, what that can do to lake quality. So what are we going to do about it? One of the biggest things in that presentation was plant plants. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm Ben. I'm the propagator at Johnson's Nursery, and I like to grow plants. So it's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? Living in Wisconsin. We have all these precious resources, beautiful lake shores that you could take a picture in Aruba and it wouldn't look this good. Wonderful places to grow up. Wisconsin has to be one of the best states just for this water quality reason. I think it's incredibly important to protect. And I'm proud to be promoting native plants here today. You can imagine you're a little raindrop. This is all imagination presentations today. Imagine you're a little water droplet, and you're falling it down in a Wisconsin woodland. Yeah, you're landing on ephemeral ponds. You're landing in these upland forests, trickling down the rocks, going down to the lowland forests. This is what you could be filtering through before you reach any body of water. I got that from Google Earth this morning. This is in Marathon County. You filter on through a white cedar swamp with high root flares, and you can see all the verdant vegetation on the ground. And then slowly you make your way down to a small stream. And that small stream, running clear and cold, is shaded by all the forests around it. See, there's the stream there. So maybe your brook trout and your Johnny darters can thrive in this kind of situation. The polar opposite of this situation would be a raindrop falling here. This is in Chicago. You fall down, you hit concrete, you go into the gutter, you pick up some salt along the way, some motor oil, maybe some trash bags, chewing gum. And then you go down again to the river's edge, and along the river's edge, there's almost nothing to filter the water. It's all impervious surface, like we talked about, riprap, big rocks, because that's the best thing money can buy for holding down ground in front of waterways. See the riprap there? The only vegetation I can see is a little bit of a pussy willow sticking out of the rocks here and some algae growing on the wall. So just remember where the water could come from, where a lot of it comes from in our state. Kind of see the development here, all the agricultural land.
and how much of that is developed. When we're in the nursery, we're measuring a lot of our nutrients to grow plants in parts per million. So to grow a plant healthy and fast, we're putting down 250 parts per million fertilizer. Imagine how much fertilizer is put down on these agricultural fields and how much of that ends up in the waterways. So whether it's agriculture or a shoreline yard in front of a lake, all that stuff ends up in the water. And I'm a pretty informal speaker, so if anyone has questions, we can just answer as we go along here. So at Johnson's Nursery, we specialize in a couple things. You got a big list of native plants in front of you in your folder, and that's all great. But what I want to make a point early here today is that not all native plants are created equal. You can see here, picture, this is 4 little white oaks all growing in a row. And you can see, just like us, all of them are a little bit different. The first one, far on the left, has a little bit of a dry spot on the top where it looks like it ran out of some water. Second one looks really nice. Third one seems to have some kind of condition where it's preventing the roots from uptaking iron and it's turning yellow. So it's not supposed to grow, even though sometimes plants are. And the one on the right here is growing happily and healthily. So it really boils down to where your plants come from. And that's very important because you're trying to get as much value as possible when you're planting your native plant. You want to get a native plant that's sourced locally. So one of the native plants that's recommended in our sheet here in front of us today is red maple. You say, well, that's great. I'm going to go recommend to my neighbor who just has lawn all the way to his lake that he should go out and get a red maple. When you look at the native range of red maple, and that's what this is here, you see it goes, all over Wisconsin, Minnesota, all the way up to Maine, down to Florida, down to Texas. A huge, broad geographical distribution. If you take a red maple from, let's say, Southern Illinois, and you transplant it to your cabin here in Washington, what do you think is going to happen to that? Anyone have a guess? Yep, not do well. Any thoughts on maybe why? Yep, could be the climate. That's 2 things, 2 huge things. And even things down to day length. That part of Illinois has a different amount of day length than Wisconsin does. Even though we're in the same time zones, our sunrises and sunsets are a little bit different. As you move further away from where you want to plant, it's going to get more and more extreme. So maybe your Southern Illinois red maple will live up here, but it might have a few problems. If you get like an East Texas red maple and try to get it up here, it's probably going to have tons of problems and likely not survive at all. So just because you have the list of red maple, don't go on Google and find cheapest possible redmaple.com and get your red maples from there. You want to make sure you're sourcing your red maples as close to home as possible. This is just another example at the nursery of how different things can be. This is 2 crops of red oak. So you think red oak, that's a nice plant, right? Grows all over Wisconsin. The red oaks on the right are about 2 feet tall and kind of a weak yellow color, like they're growing, but they're not growing like they should. And they were collected in Milwaukee County. The red oaks that are on the left, being gestured to by my gal Lynn, they're about 6 feet tall on average, dark green, vigorous growing, healthy plants. Those are selected from a plant on top of the Niagara Escarpment, which is a big ridge of rock that runs, if you imagine, Door County all the way to Niagara Falls. So they came from on top of Niagara Escarpment, and they're growing. And I'm not a scientist, but if I had to take a soil test where those red oaks versus the Milwaukee County red oaks, even though they were probably only 40 miles away, if that the Niagara Escarpment ones are much more alkaline tolerant. So in this specific site, they do much better. And a lot of people that plant oaks end up with something that looks like this. Say, why is my oak dying? So, well, you didn't really check where it came from. You took an oak that wasn't alkaline tolerant, you planted it in a place with high alkaline. And that's always a shame because oaks are usually not cheap. So I kind of wanted to move into just showing off some wonderful native trees that we have to offer at Johnson's. We usually have these species, but not always. Sometimes we sell out. We're working and fixing that. So the first one I want to talk to you guys about is speckled alder. And if you guys have like any personal experiences with these plants, feel free to like chime in. I think it's really fun to talk about plants. Yeah, so speckled alder has a nice shrubby short characteristic. It's got these wonderful little yellow catkins in spring. And it's got these tiny little cones that almost look like pine cones in fall. This is really good for supporting wildlife. Tons of different caterpillar species like eating the foliage. And these little cones make tiny little nutlets that the birds love to eat. Nope, the leaves look a lot like basswood. So they're similar in that way, but they're different species. Yellow birch is another really nice plant. This is much more of a larger tree, kind of in that 40-foot plus range. This would be a nice one to have in front of your house because it has really high branching. It doesn't tolerate much shade, so it usually limbs itself up. So all you have is like a nice thin trunk in the landscape. And it loves really wet, moist conditions. The best featured ornamentally is the yellowish bark, which on old stems kind of turns a little bit more towards gray, but on young stems, it's really a golden orangish yellow. And you can kind of see these a lot of times in northern Wisconsin growing up on their own roots like this, like stilts. And that's because they like grow on top of rotted logs. And as the logs degrade, the roots stay, and then they're up in the air.
Hey, Mark, well,
Well, it should. When did you plant it?
you
2 years ago, and about how big was it, the root maker?
planted.
Okay, in the same area. I'm almost wondering if that area is a little bit too dry for yellow birch. If the oaks are thriving, and this is not, that's the first thing I think of is it might be a hair on the plant. So it might not be establishing as quick as it should. If it's still alive and still going.
Even alive, I was just wondering.
Yeah, yep, so this plant is definitely not drought tolerant, which is why it ended up on the Shoreline presentation. Yeah, if it dries out too much, it'll really suffer. Yep, bronze birch borer, which usually infects like larger stems. So odds are that's not what you're seeing. It could be a different insect. But yeah, these definitely love moisture. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, like shade level, lifespan.
Yeah, like that.
Yeah, so like alder, an old alder would probably be like 35 years old. And then the colony slowly starts to die out and other colonies kind of take over. I would say up to like 25 feet at the maximum. Usually they're a lot shorter. I would say 12 to 18 would be average. And like you were kind of mentioning birch, I think in your lifespan. Yellow birch is the oldest lasting birch. They can last like 200-300 years. Versus like a paper birch, which is old at 75, 80. Which is still a long time, but yep, we do have, actually I see you found it, but like that little native plant guide has a lot of really great like factoid information and a lot of really good specs on what the plant likes. So it'll tell you like what soil level it likes, what light level it likes, any other like, helpful tips on care, keeping the plants happy. It's all really good information.
Also on the site,
So now things path, you go on that. I would work with many of them use a plant, but. Lot more pictures, a lot of information. That's all.
Yep, really good stuff on that. I've got like 5 or 10 articles on there. So silver maple is probably one of the best plants for planting on a shoreline for like shoreline stabilization, just because it's so big and so aggressive, that it can really like lock in the soil and it'll cast a lot of shade over the actual water body itself. Like Rob pointed out actually in one of the diagrams, it had like, here's your situation, and it had an X for like how to solve it. And native plants was not X where it said fish habitat, but this is great fish habitat right over the water right here. Silver maple grows fast, grows vigorously. It's really nice because it has a lot of shade, but just enough sun gets through the leaves. We can grow other stuff underneath it as well. So it's got like a really good feature that way. Long, arching, graceful stems. Really nice to see over water, I'd say. And it really occupies like floodplains out of the river. But it can grow anywhere. Yeah, so this plant, like right here, that was likely planted in like the 60s. So that plant is only 50 years old, if that. Yep, and they get this big in that short. They got really popular right after Dutch elm disease came through and killed all the elm trees. This was like a nice, quick, easy replacement that could fill in afterwards. So a lot of those plants kind of got planted in the 50s and 60s here in Wisconsin. The problem with this plant, and it kind of got a bad name, is that it does get so big. And if we're talking about how far away to put your house from stuff, people put these plants like right up next to their house, and they're not really very strong with it. Like they're pretty strong, but if one branch breaks and the branch is this big and the house, that cause a lot of damage. But if your house is 100 feet from the water, just find it put down by the water. River birch is another nice plant. So all the birches are known for their attractive bark, and this one's no exception. It has like peachy, white, flaky bark going to brown, and really nice to put really close to the water. This plant can last for months under water in spring. So if you have like a flooding zone, especially along like a creek or a river, they're really good for that. Birches rank really highly as far as like caterpillar food. If you like wildlife, that's the very bottom of the food chain. Is like you have to have the good insects for your birds to come in, or your animals to come in. So it's good for that too. I would say fairly fast, probably the fastest birch, and again, fairly short-lived. Like an old river birch would probably be like 100. They're the most resistant to bronze birch borer, which is a native disease that can knock out your birch. But not besides that one. Any other birch questions? Hackberry, this is Celtis occidentalis, one of the most famous trees at Johnson's Nursery. We sell thousands of these a year. City foresters love them because they make like the perfect street tree. And that's kind of a common theme with a lot of these native riparian or shoreline plants, is they're incredibly tolerant of low oxygen levels in their root systems. So they're actually found in the wild along waterways, but they are tolerant of really compacted soils as well. So like along city streets, between the street and the sidewalk, they make some of the perfect trees there. And that's why elms, again, were so commonly planted. And hackberry makes the list too of really popular street trees, even though it's like a bottomland kind of hardwood. So hackberry has this kind of interesting warty bark, which is not terribly interesting, but if you get about like 3 nose lengths away, It's like super cool. It's like looking at the Grand Canyon turned sideways. Because it's got all these like ridges and valleys and ups and downs and knobs and stuff. It looks like little mesas. You gotta be really close. And then nice shade tree, fairly disease free. It gets a couple little foliar issues that can look a little funny on the plant, but it doesn't really mess with the overall look. Turns a nice yellow in fall. And it's got these berries on it that ripen really late compared to a lot of other fruits, like even November, December, January. It seems like they're the most ripe. And they feed like huge flocks of birds. Like we've got one in front of our house, and it's amazing every year to see like the different waves of birds come that use this tree for food. Like cedar waxwings and sorts of stuff. Sycamore. I wish I had a better picture of sycamore. These are all my photos, by the way. Very proud. So this is a plant we've just started to grow at Johnson's Nursery, and I'll kind of show a different picture of it later. But it's got these like really big maple-like leaves. The plant itself is very fast growing, probably one of the fastest growing trees you can buy. And it has like a really nice upright habit. So whereas that silver maple had that broad spreading kind of low habit, this thing stays very upright and straight, very nice for that factor. The bark on this tree has a nice white character, and it kind of has like flaky plates that I'll show you a little bit later. But yeah, really nice plant. A really aggressive root system too. Fun fact, the biggest tree around in eastern North America, east of the Mississippi, is a sycamore. So that's how big they can get. Yep, close relative of the plane tree, and plane tree is like a hybrid between the American and the Oriental sycamore. And there's a lot of like really nice cultivars that Johnson's offers as well that are really good for street trees. But if you want like the true native, this is the true native. Yes. It is. Yeah, so it is a Wisconsin native, but it's only native in Wisconsin at the very like southwestern corner, like in Grant County along the Mississippi River. So it's like a native Wisconsin tree, but it's not native to Washington County. And it's like it keeps making the lists for like climate winners. I don't know if you've ever like heard of climate winners and climate losers, but this is a very tolerant tree, so it always is on the winner list. And so I went and had an expedition to Grant County. I found a bunch of seeds, so I grabbed them, and now we're growing sycamores. So cottonwood, Populus deltoides, is probably the tallest tree in Wisconsin. There might be a couple white pines a little bit bigger, but this is probably the fastest growing tree that you can buy. And you can see my wife down here and how big that tree can be. My wife is 6'2", so that tree is like 6'2" diameter. Pretty neat. I would not recommend planting this close to this building. I just kind of wanted to show like how big this plant. Cottonwood can withstand a whole ton of flooding. They can be submerged for a long time, and they really hold the soil together well. They have a vigorous root system, and they're really quite amazing. In some places, they can be kind of weedy, and they're definitely a messy tree. They drop tons of like sticky little buds and little branches, and like when I say little branches, I guess I mean probably 3 to 4 foot branches on the regular. But if it is like down by a creek or towards a pond or a lake, it's probably just fine down. So this right here, you can barely see it. You see my mouth? So this little tree right here, that's a sycamore. That's probably about 100. That tree is probably 120 to 30 feet tall. A little bit closer than the sycamore. The sycamore is like down a little bit further down. Quaking aspen is another nice plant to put near the water. It's tolerant of a lot of conditions. That's like the common theme. It's tolerant. Likes moisture, nice white bark, turns beautiful golden colors in fall, and grows fast. Swamp white oak is also a really nice option. This is really the only oak that's very appropriate for really wet conditions. Most oaks like it quite a bit drier than this. Bur oak can sometimes get pretty close to the water, but this is the best one. Well, if it's growing well, these can be a good upland tree too. They're just the only oak that's tolerant of that weight. I'm glad to hear the oaks are doing well. I'm sorry the birch isn't doing so hot. You should take one of my cards and send me a picture and I might be able to diagnose it. I don't think it's too late. I think you can turn it around. But yeah, this tree is nice because it has a nice X-current growth form, really nice and straight. And it has this neat feature where it holds onto its leaves in fall. So it kind of rattles in the wind. It adds sound to the winter weather. And it casts a lot of shade. So if you have a place where you have a lot of baby swamp white oaks, it actually acts like an evergreen where it keeps that place colder longer. If you guys have ever been in like a conifer forest in spring, it'll be like 90 degrees and sunny, but then you go into the conifer forest and it's like 60 degrees and you can still find like little pockets of snow in July. It's really neat. So tamarack is probably the favorite on this list for me. I really love this plant. It is Wisconsin's only deciduous conifer. So typically your conifers you pick as evergreen, but this one drops its needles every fall. And before it drops its needles, it turns this beautiful burnt gold color. And it's just unbeatable. And hopefully you guys have seen some highways in Wisconsin in fall, and these just pop out from the landscape. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that really
Well, I would say that, like geologically speaking, tamarack has been moving north over the last 10,000 years. So 10,000 years ago, big glacier came, wiped out everything, pushed all the tree species south, and it receded over time. So the tamaracks have been chasing the glaciers back. So they've been heading north for the last 10,000 years. If there's climate change or not, whether you believe it or not, whatever your political leanings might be, doesn't matter to me. The trees tell the story. And if you go to like that southern Illinois place I was showing you before, if they dig deep enough on these like conifer swamps there, they find logs from tamarack that are about 10,000 years old. It's like petrified wood. And on top of them now are bald cypress. And I don't know if you guys know what bald cypress is, but it's like kind of like the southern equivalent to the tamarack. It grows in swamps. It's a conifer. It's deciduous. So over the course of 10,000 years, estimated, they can count the tree rings, so they have a pretty good date. And they can like go through the layers of trees. Then they go from tamarack to bald cypress. So they've been leaving for 10,000 years, but they're still here. And I would say if you want to plant tamarack, go ahead and do it. Probably good for a long time yet. This plant grows very well outside of its natural environment. So it's naturally found in bogs and lowlands, places like that. But if you plant it in an upland, it grows just fine. And still offers a lot of benefits that way too. Yep, and I drove past the nice tamarack bog on the way up here from West Dallas.
Oh, the tamarack. Here's the gold state in Milwaukee, all the way west. It's the local tannery. When in Milwaukee was the tamarack. Tanning the height, that's what I had heard.
Yep, nope, I heard the same thing, so we must watch the same show on PBS or something. But that is one of the reasons. And then when they ran out of tamaracks in the area, then they had to move to hemlocks. And they didn't use hemlocks at first because the chain or the saws that they had weren't strong enough to actually get through a hemlock tree. And then eventually they got stronger saws, and then they were able to use those next. It absolutely does. Yep, that's a. Yep, so they changed the soil composition pretty quickly and pretty severely, but at a slight level. So really the change only goes down like a couple of inches. Usually if the soil is somewhat alkaline, the cation exchange capacity prevents it from really changing that soil very deep. But right at the surface level, it can like prevent other plants from even growing. It can almost like, yeah, I would say probably not at all, unless the shade. I think the shade of the plant would affect it before the acid from the needles would. But like turf, for example, grass has really tiny shallow roots, so it would kill turf because the roots have nothing to go on. Yeah, so it's kind of funny because you can find bogs and you find plants this big and they do like a tree ring cut on that plant and it's like 150 years old, this big. And you could like touch the tree and the tree like moves around in the bog. But at the nursery we grow them in like, nice potting mix and stuff, and they can grow like 3 or 4 feet in a year. So they really are good at taking advantage of whatever nutrition they can find. Northern white cedar is a great plant for any moist area. It's got a really dense fibrous root system, good at holding soil down. The one drawback this plant has is deer pressure. So if you have a lot of deer on your property, this will be like their favorite food in winter. How does speckled alder do? Oh, speckled alder. If I go way back, right there. So speckled alder is also deer food, but it's like a naturally shrubby species. So even if the deer do nip the tips and rub some stems, it'll just keep sucking right back in the face. I was excited to learn all these like little factoids about it. Thanks. Yeah,
I think deer is one of the most common questions.
Yeah.
Plants. What can you plant that are resistant? Yeah, we need a buckthorn.
it's a good observation. It's true.
We wish they would.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a nice evergreen plant. Good for screening if you don't want to see your neighbors. The reason it's called arborvitae, this is kind of the fun fact of this plant. When the French fur traders were first like kind of getting into Wisconsin to like, do their fur trading, they would all get scurvy in winter, and a lot of them would die. And scurvy is caused by a vitamin C deficiency. And they would actually make a tea, and they learned this from the native original folks that were here. They would make a tea out of the foliage, and that would have enough vitamin C to get them through the winter. So that's why it's called arborvitae, which is French or Latin or something for tree of life, which is pretty cool. Also, I'm told you can eat the bark. I'll let you know if the apocalypse comes. Yeah. So moving away from trees a little, we can talk about some shrubs. Gray dogwood is a really good plant for covering a lot of area in a pretty short amount of time. Also, someone mentioned buckthorn. That's a really common issue, in wetlands. I'm not sure about shorelines. It's probably in there too. So if you ever do a removal or know someone that does a removal, you could recommend something like buckthorn or something like gray dogwood to go in there after that and cover a lot of ground really fast and kind of keep the pressure of the buckthorn down. So not only does it cover that ground, it offers really good wildlife habitat. It's nice and shrubby. It can range from like these really dense colonies, like the picture on the right, or these slightly looser colonies like this, where they're infiltrated by other different native plants. But you go into these sites, and a lot of times there'll be like buckthorn seedlings right up to the edge of the colony. And as soon as you hit the dogwood, it seems like the seedlings stop. So I don't know if there's like an allelopathic thing, and all that means is like, just like the tamaracks and the acid, that these might be releasing a chemical or creating a condition where the buckthorn can't spread. So it might be that. Red osier dogwood doesn't seem to have near the effect. This seems to be the best one for that. Yep, it does. Yep, I would say probably comparable to some of those prairie plants where they go down 10, 12 feet or something like that. I would say the stem color would be the easiest way to tell. Both of them have white berries. Both of them have like a nice maroon fall color. Gray dogwood has these huge colonial tendencies. So if it's a huge patch, it's probably gray dogwood. And if you get close enough where you can see the color of the stem, you know, red osier dogwood's a bright cardinal red or cherry red color. Versus gray dogwood, where it'll have that same red, but only on the very tips of the plant. Yep, and the rest of the stem will be gray, and that's how that's. Neat thing about all of the fruits on all of our dogwoods, they are really high in fat content, which is a little bit different than most of our fruits. It's like sugar and water. This is more like the mayonnaise of berries to wildlife. Yeah, I mean, I don't, design wise, I don't think it would have a place very close to your house, just because it can get so big. You'll have like a sea of dogwood in front of you. But I don't think the roots are that aggressive that they would like damage your foundation. Nor are they very water seeking. So they might not like, you know, so like a drain pipes and stuff like that. I don't think they're gonna get it. Yep, it really varies between colonies. The question was, how tall do they get? Some colonies seem to be like 3 or 4 feet, like this picture here. Like none of those plants are above 2 feet. And then you go look at that plant, and that was like a 6 to 8 footer that they're seeing. And I would say they can get up to that 10, 12 foot on the extreme end. This would probably be average, about 5. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that colony is probably many years old, but it spreads probably a foot or two. Goes off the root. Yeah, so the way this plant spreads is it has like a single stem to start, and from the root systems, they push a lateral root underground and then come up with another stem, you know, maybe a foot to 3 feet away, say on average. So then you end up with like this spreading colony over time. And they are prolific seed producers as well, so then they can also spread by seed nearby. Staghorn sumac, Rus typhina. That's a nice plant for a little bit sandier soils. So around this part of the state, you don't see these by lakes very often. But if you do have like a sandier area by your lake, this is a great plant to try out. It's got glossy green palmate or not palmate, compound leaves. Really nice red fruits in the fall. I guess you can use those red fruits to make like a lemonade style drink. But they look really hairy to me, so I've never really tried it yet. Just imagining it makes my throat scratchy. So. And as far as fall color go, this might be the best plant in Wisconsin for fall color. It's got like that flame red color that everyone on the highway sees when they drive by. Again, this one spreads underground with rhizomes, a lot like the gray dogwood. So you end up with like a big colony. Yeah, they're like deer. Uh-huh.
Come in there and then you just.
Yep, they're like really. Yeah, they're a really good wildlife plant for sure. And if you've ever been in like a sick or a sumac patch, it has a lot of the same capacity for allelopathy as the dogwood, where you go in there and a lot of times it's just a couple different grasses and forbs and then just sumac stems. So whatever it is, how they grow, they keep everything else from growing very as well. So this might be a look for more help. Yeah, like on the old root systems. but seems to be really good at keeping out invasives. Chokecherry, this is probably the best plant for overall fruit production if you're trying to attract wildlife. Every year it has these kind of bounteous caterpillar shaped flowers in spring. And every fall it's got drooping clusters of cherries that are quite large. They're the largest native cherry. And oftentimes there's so many of them that they're pulling the branches down. They'll just be on a small plant like this, you'll get like close to 10 pounds of fruit. It's like insane. Probably like 10 feet tall. I would say typically they're shorter than that. Like if it's growing in a shaded situation, especially, a 5 or 6 foot plant is. I have seen a few plants that are like close to 20, 30 feet tall. Pretty rare. American plum. This is another really nice plant to put near your water, especially if you're interested in gathering some of your food. Usually they're this kind of purple color that you see on the left, but you can find different plums with yellows, reds, deep blues, different times. Has a really nice flower show in spring, nice billowing white flowers that give way to shinier leaves in the fall. The one bad thing about this is it almost looks identical to buckthorn when buckthorn removes. So it might be a good thing to replace buckthorn with, but it doesn't look all that different from buckthorn, even though it does have a lot of benefits that buckthorn does not. Like the flower, which just looks nice, and the fruit. All of the prunus, which is the plums and the cherries, all of them rank really high as far as like insect attractiveness, among the highest. And if you've ever tried to grow like a cherry tree, like the cherries, you know, like how many different things they'll teach them. Cornisomomum, this is silky dogwood. It's a lot like your red osier dogwood that you're talking about, but it's got more of a maroon stem. And the claim to fame with this plant is it's got these really nice baby blue fruits. I think they're quite attractive. High in fat content, like all the dogwood fruits are, and really nice kind of goldish red fall color. The picture I have is a little bit early, but it continues to get more gold and more red as time goes on. This one is the most water tolerant of all the dogwoods. So if you're going like right up next to the water, this is the one I would say not picky. I've seen them growing in like bog muck up to rocky like stream bed soils. Probably 6 feet to 8 feet on average, I would say. A lot of these shrubs, the really nice thing is if 6 to 8 feet is like affecting your view, or if it's a little bit too big for your design, you can come up with like a pruning strategy to keep them at a smaller size. So all of them take a hedging really well. You can do like a stem removal to keep the height down. And as the plant establishes, a lot of shrubs over time will kind of like slow down their growth. So in the beginning, when that plant is taking up space and growing vigorously, it's you got to prune it every year to keep it the size you want. But as it is aging and slowing down, it'll like kind of slow down with you. You just have to prune it every couple of years after that. American elderberry. This is a really good plant for wet areas. This one can grow in almost pure sand all the way to compacted clay, which is really great. Huge panicles of flowers. I think it's the biggest panicle in Wisconsin. You can get panicles, and panicle just means cluster. You can get panicles almost 2 feet wide, which is cool. I got my first date in college by bringing her some elderberry flowers. Okay. We've been married for 10 years. We just had a little girl actually too. So if I look a little sleepy, it's because I slept 6 hours, but it was like 2 hours on, 1 hour off, 2 hours on. That's good. That's fine. And then also these kind of ripen to a nice berry, which are edible for people. Some people make elderberry wine. Some people like crush them up into a syrup. over vanilla ice cream. They are, yeah, they're pretty common along. So they pop up. They don't last terribly long. These are old planted, I think 5 or 10 years. And then they can start to move out of a cell too. Yeah, they do a really good job at keeping their shape. They're kind of like, if you imagine like a big vase, they kind of want to be like. And they don't really spread. You know how the dogwoods made colonies of themselves? These make like a little colony of themselves, but then they kind of just stop. You know, they spend 5 years kind of getting ground, and that's kind of the end of where they want to spread to. Then there's flower and fruit until they get killed or something else. Glossy black chokeberry. This is another buckthorn lookalike. It actually is pretty confusing when you find buckthorn and this together. And a lot of places where buckthorn grows is where these used to be. So when they do buckthorn removals, they incidentally remove the last remaining parts of these. So they're a pretty rare plant in Wisconsin. They're in the apple family or the rose family. So they've got little roseate flowers, little black fruits that develop in fall. Fun fact about this plant is they have the highest antioxidant level of any known fruit anywhere in the world. Antioxidants do something, not sure. But people take a couple people put berries in their smoothie and stuff to raise their antioxidants. And they have a really great bright red fall color. Buttonbush is probably the most water tolerant shrub in Wisconsin. They can actually be underwater for 11 months out of the year. So as long as they have a little time above water grade, then they're good. Someone pointed out, one of my interns last year said that the flowers look like the coronavirus. But it's a vigorous growing plant, nice shiny green leaf, and it gets these little button-shaped flowers that are really a pollinator magnet. This plant starts really late in the year, and it kind of bridges the gap between like the spring flowering plants and the fall flowering plants. There's not a lot that's flowering in that like July, August timeframe, but this plant does. So when they're blooming at the nursery, they're just like abuzz with bees and different pollinators. Different varieties. I would say the average would be 5 to 8 feet. So a little bit on the bigger end, but pretty nice. Yes, they grow best in full sun. I think they would survive part shade, but you're not going to get like any flowering, and I think they'll look a little scraggly. I riddles your dogwood lady loves. Anyway, riddles your dogwood. Here it is. It's got those bright red stems, and these are the best for stem coloration in winter in Wisconsin for obvious reasons. A lot like the other dogwoods, fatty fruits, little white flowers in spring, but this one's the best for that stem coloration. Did I have like an hour to talk? Ish? Okay. All right, we're on time. Yeah. So winterberry holly, this one is a bog plant in Wisconsin. This one's often found right along with tamarack. Sometimes your best hunting grounds will have hollies in it. I've heard people say that in the past as well. Probably the single best fruit show for Wisconsin winters. The plant will develop these little clusters of red berries on them and then keep them on there all the way through December, typically till about Christmas time before the birds start to eat them. I think it must have to do with like some kind of sugar content and tannins in the berry that after a couple hard freezes and thaws, then the sugars come to the forefront and they become edible. Best in full sun, but they can do part shade as well. And they're kind of surprising, like the fruit production on these is so heavy that if the plants are in part shade, they'll kind of take a few years off. And then as soon as they get enough energy in reserve, then they'll have like this beautiful year of fruit. Yes, so I was gonna bring that up. You read the book, didn't you? Yeah. So this is one of the few plants in Wisconsin that come with male and female. So when you purchase them, you have to buy one labeled female and one labeled male in order to get fruits like this. Or if you buy the straight species, you just have to buy enough and know your odds that they're just like us, 50-50 male and female. Yep, a lot of designers will kind of do a 1-to-7 ratio. Yep. You know, I think I have seen like a few white varieties. Yeah, I don't know if it's this species or not. It might be a similar one. And there's a yellow one too. Yeah, but I think the red is the best one. But even like when you're going through the bogs where these live, they're like different shades of red. So you can go from like that deep cherry red to like fire truck red into kind of almost orange and like pumpkin color. I think it must be genetic because you'll find like different color ones right next to each other. So probably just like eye color or hair color, probably just varies from. Yeah. No, I don't think it's acid based. But it is really interesting. So it's neat to see different seedlings together. Meadowsweet, this is a really great one if you're concerned about maintenance. This is a tiny shrub. It only gets to about 1 to 2 feet tall, so you hardly ever have to prune it unless you want to keep it 6 inches tall. I don't know how sensitive you guys are to your lake views, but this one's stays small, has a nice flower in spring, really attractive to pollinators. And when I was taking this picture, you could see this little bee's tongue was sticking out. So he was like ready to go to get that flower. So it's a small shrubby plant, spreads by seed. Pretty nondescript fruit show, just has like a dry papery cluster. But it's pretty nice. I'm told you can make baskets out of it. Never tried. So getting out of the shrubs, we're kind of moving into the perennials. And this is probably like the easiest stuff to add because you can buy perennials fairly inexpensively and they're very small. So you can install them easily, you can maintain them easily, and they take hardly any work at all. Especially in kind of a native naturalistic setting. You don't have to do any cleanup or anything like that. So Culver's root has these really nice spikes of white flowers. It's a really nice bottle brush kind of shape. Really attractive to pollinators, and designers like it just because that unique flower shape. It's a little atypical of what you would typically see. Joe Pyeweed has these clusters of pink flowers, and it's a very big plant, probably 5 or 6 feet. So this is a really good one for like the middle of the rain garden if you're putting in one of those. And it's kind of cool for kids and adults because flowers are so high you can get right in next to them. So it's a great place to observe pollinators. It starts a little bit later in the year, so this one kind of helps that like early summer pollinator lapse as well. Red milkweed or swamp milkweed, as its name implies, is typically found in swamps and wet areas. This plant is good food for monarch butterflies. It's probably the biggest milkweed. It gets pretty big, like 3 to 4 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet wide. Tons of red flowers on there. Yeah, really nice to plant for attracting monarchs and other pollinators. This one's kind of new to Johnson's. This is rose mallow, which is Hibiscus mosquitoes. And it comes in these kind of neat different color combinations, all from seed. Typically, when I see them in the wild, they're all white. So you can see a couple white flowers in there. And some of them were a little bit pink. So we collected a bunch of them and I put 2 of the little bit pink ones together, separate from all the other ones. And this is the following generation. So now we went from white and a little bit pink. Now we have white, a little bit pink, really pink, like the one in the middle there, and almost to like a fuchsia red. So we're doing a little bit of plant breeding on our hibiscus. But this one tricks everybody every year because it doesn't even start to grow until like June 15th. Most people buy their plants from like May 15th or something, Mother's Day maybe, through June, and then they don't want to buy plants that this year. But they're missing out on this summer favorite. Yep, these are gargantuan plants. I want to say the top height for these is like maybe 8 or 9 feet or something in perfect conditions. In average conditions, they're typically but they're nice airy plants too, so they don't take up a ton of room and they seem to stay put. They don't spread a ton laterally, so it just kind of stays in the little cluster. But this is fast becoming one of my favorite plants. And this one I didn't label, but this is a Liatris, which is meadow. One word is gay feather, and then one is like blazing star. That's it, blazing star. And there's been a couple times at the nursery where things almost felt like magic. And when these things are blooming, there's so many insects all up and around you that it feels like magic when you go in that crop. So this plant on the right is Liatris ligustylus, and that's the #1 plant for attracting monarch butterflies. There was probably 100 plants, and there's probably 150 monarchs fluttering around. It was pretty neat. Yeah, it was insane. So like you would go in there and you'd like, I don't know if you've ever heard a swarm of butterflies, but I never had until I went into this little patch of plants. Whereas just like you could hear all their wings and all the little air currents moving around. Pretty cool. As you can tell, I have a hard time describing that. So I would plan on planting a lot of those in any. I think they just. So this is Meadow Blazing Star, which is Liatris pycnostachya, and then Liatris ligustylus, which I think that's like large blazing star. That's a really good one too. They both are very similar. Tall spikes of purple flowers. The spikes of flowers themselves are 2 feet long, and they last quite a long time too, maybe 3 weeks before they stop blooming and start to go into seed. Yeah. Harlequin blue flag iris. I just call it iris. This is a nice native Wisconsin plant. This is another one for those who are concerned about maintenance. This is an incredibly clean plant, almost no problems, slow spreading clumps over time, and really short. So they only get like maybe 18 inches tall. And that can be nice if you're trying to preserve your view while still planting leaves. They also are a semi-emergent plant, which means they kind of come out of the water as well. So they're definitely not afraid to be submerged part of the year or even most of the year. And marsh marigold, which is another teeny tiny plant that I thought I'd throw in here. This one's kind of like a spring ephemeral. So if you guys know what that means, it's a plant that does most of its life cycle in spring. Before the trees are leafing out, they're gonna bloom, they're gonna flower, they're gonna make their seeds, and then go to sleep before the trees even leaf out. This plant is typically found in like little seeps and stuff in forests, but it does pretty good on shorelines as well. The flowers themselves are pretty nice. They're kind of a golden buttercup yellow, and they have like a really neat shimmer to it, almost shiny. So they kind of catch the light, and this picture shows it a little bit where the light, that isn't like sunlight, that's like reflected sunlight, which is kind of cool. Yeah, I'd say the flowers are maybe up to quarter size, so not that big. So pretty small, but the plant itself stays like under a foot, like a real mound. Yeah. They are really a treat to find. You could try by seed, but I think if you want, I guarantee you plant a little plant. Cardinal flower, beautiful red spikes of red flowers. When they look at like ecology of plants, I think moths and butterflies prefer whites and yellows. But if something's red flowered, that means it's mostly pollinated by hummingbirds. Someone told me that. Hopefully it's true. So this is a hummingbird pollinated plant. If you're into hummingbirds, this is a great one to put in. Tolerates really mucky soils and even partial light conditions. So it's a nice plant for that situation. I find these to be pretty short lasting on the average. So if you buy one of these, it'll kind of be in one spot for 2 to 5 years, but then they'll kind of like disappear over time. And if they didn't find like the perfect spot for their seedlings to grow, you're not gonna have any more lobelia in that situation. And deer. They like clip it off right as it comes out of the ground. So as we approach my hour limit here, I just kind of want to impress to you guys like how important it is to like maintain these shorelines. I think we heard that ad nauseum in the first presentation, but I'm a firm believer. I really think that all these critters are important to us, little herons, all the salamanders. I grew up catching these guys, and here they're under threat. I get kind of mad. So all these animals are depending on us to do the right thing. So I think we should do our best. And now we can play judge the shoreline. So this is at Olbrich Botanical Garden. I don't know if you guys have been there, but you can still keep a really formal shoreline and still have some plantings. You can see this isn't really a dwelling and doesn't have plumbing or anything, but you can definitely see impervious surface area. So what did we learn from our last talk? This is probably like a little too close to that water. But, you know, put some plants in there. This is a tiny little rain garden, probably 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, kind of a teardrop shape. And they just put it in a little low spot next to a gravel bike rack pad. And it's probably 15 feet from the entranceway to their nature center. So even these little plantings are pretty easy to install. I would imagine this is something like 25 to 50 perennials they purchased and one tree. So even that little bit of a purchase and a tiny little idea of a design, you can do something about it. And you can see here, if you study our plant identification, we've got like tamarack, we've got orange butterfly weed, different milkweed, the common milkweed here. There's some of those liatris just starting. Here's my hand. And Wisconsin's waterways are starting to face like some pretty big problems, you know, even besides us building them. You know, we have emerald ash borer coming through, which is destroying thousands and thousands of acres of ash forests. So if you can remember that we're measuring our nutrient values at the nursery, parts per million, 200 parts per million is plenty. How much is something like this going to change that water? Sure, this is like a little marsh that's feeding it. So how much is that going to add to the nutrient load of that lake? What can we do to kind of mitigate some of the damage done here? Invasive species are another really big challenge. This shoreline, you could say, hey, it's covered in vegetation. That's better than asphalt, concrete, and riprap. But now we have pure honeysuckle growing all along the edge of this water. So that's providing some things. It's giving animals shelter and providing some food. But now we're losing a whole ton of diversity from native plant species. You can see like maybe one last dogwood in there hanging out. So you can see more ash damage here, kind of in the center. Trying to replace some of that. And that this is like a bad example of what we don't want. You know, grass all the way up to the water. So remembering like all these trees that are really tough, you know, all the spring flood tolerant species, that's what we want to be focusing on planting, because our rains, just measurably, are recently becoming more infrequent and heavy. So we used to have like lots of little rains. Now we're having fewer, bigger rains. And so flooding, I think was mentioned, is becoming more common. So we're going to have to focus on flood tolerant trees. And even the littlest things you can do, this is in the Milwaukee River. This is like a tiny little floating bog that you can buy. So they have this like just chained to the side of a pier, like a little fishing pier. And they have like, I don't know if you guys have been there, but like Lakeshore County or Lakeshore State Park, Milwaukee. It's all these huge boulders. They had to like, I don't even know how they got them there. Some kind of engineering feat. So, and there's almost no plants in these huge boulders holding the shoreline in place. And then they had this tiny little floating thing, and there's like 6 little birds flying around it. And, like you could see underneath it, and there's like 3 like little bluegills hanging out underneath it. Like this is the only. What was that?
You guys know?
No, we don't. But there's quite a few landscape companies that can get this done. But this is like I thought it just a neat idea, and it just showcased like how important that habitat is to these animals. In so many places around here, there's no habitat. Yeah, so this is in like a little cove, so I don't think they allow any motorized boating in that little harbor. They allow like kayaking and stuff. It seemed, I don't know, pretty durable. It's been there probably 2 or 3 years. I'm sure it's encountered a couple winters and some bigger waves, but I don't have a ton of experience on these, so I'm not selling it. I'm just saying that anything we can do is probably better than nothing. And it's embarrassing, isn't it, that here in Wisconsin, there's so much water. Talking about how we can take care of it, and we're doing a good job sometimes, but I'd say most of us in this room would agree we could do better. And the rest of the world, even the rest of our own country, is dealing with things like this. So this is the Hoover Dam. And I think that is a 300-foot drop between the dark rock and the light rock. The dam doesn't even seem to be holding hardly anything back. You get to the edge and you look all the way down, and there's just a little bit of water at the base. So we should really protect our water because we are blessed to have it. So there's a little marsh marigold in the wild. So yeah, thank you guys for listening.
So you sell to contractors.
Yeah, I should probably talk about Johnson's Nursery a little bit.
Yeah, could you hit on Johnson's and could you hit on, why you buy it?
Yeah, so Johnson's Nursery is a full service nursery. We have retail, we have landscape design and install, we have wholesale. So yes, we sell to contractors, but if you just wanted to come in and look at what plants we have for sale that day, certainly welcome. Well, thanks. And all of our natives, we source very locally, and I source like probably 90% of them myself. So I know exactly the genealogy of these trees, and I know what you're buying, which is also a really important thing. If you want the best plant for your situation, you have to know your local propagator. And
Well, it's got the local, landscape herb. That was the deal with.
yep, that could be the situation. You can just show up and you can kind of ask our designers some questions too, and they'll often give you some good advice. Kind of depends on like the scale of the project you're looking for. If you have like 10 feet of shoreline to work on, I think you could handle that yourself. But if you're doing like this huge shoreline project, then yeah, I would say get a contractor involved and have our people involved on the design and plant selection. And they can like take all these natives I've shown you, and they can do their art to like make it an actual composition. It's gonna look like something, kind of product. That's right. So you can get our natives at a discount rate in June. If you join the wild ones, 40% off.
To answer your question on the landscape, so you can come in and buy plants retail, just walk in and yards and all that. There's a program called We Plan, You Plant. And we can pair you with a designer that's for smaller projects, foundation planting, potentially like a shoreline design. And we don't charge for that, and we're just doing it without a price contract. And as long as you buy the plant. If you have a full landscape install, you have a full landscape. We do full landscape design. Yes, we do the work also. It's not the biggest, our biggest piece of our business is sales to the municipalities, we sell thousands of people. Any other different municipalities, it's the giant project of FSD, where we have 400 of our number 5 trees. It's like a fiddle different site from the walking vehicle. Or if you work in landscape contract, you can our customers, but we specify with them and say, hey, I would like all my plants to come out of the nursery. If I'm a buyer, I want to make sure whatever is installed in my yard is from Ben or from Johnson.
Because Ben, who's the one who out there collecting the seed, go to another nursery, walk up to them and say, hey, where'd you get the seed for that? And Ben can say, it's a float trip that he took 3 years ago and collected the seed.
That's what the sycamore took from.
That is almost unheard of, because that's bigger intense, they're going to go out, collect the seed, bring it back, and they're going off. All that kind of stuff from southeast Wisconsin, and then goes out looking for specific trees that are the best, the biggest, the most interesting, and that kind of thing. Population. And then throughout the production process, he's selecting, when you see those trees out in the field, you see the ones that are yellow, those don't make it close to sale. Always looking for the best to help you. Also, what we provide to Johnson for our smaller trailers and stuff, we're talking about the Shoreline. We don't sell fluff, we sell a number 1 gallon container, and that's more expensive. What you're getting is a plant that's sort of established for a couple. So when you put them in your yard, they establish quickly. They require less maintenance and care. If an animal attacks it, if it's cold or really dry, they survive because they have a root system that's well established. You use lessons. So I put a pollinator patch in my yard, and used all our number 1, and had an old tree that I took out, planted it all, and in the first year, my 10-year-old daughter, a lot of the plants were higher than different ones lower, but some of the biggest ones were higher than that. And I just almost filmed it, and no hardly any watering, and there's a butterfly and birds and pollinator magnets. So that's something we kind of preach at Johnson. Then a little bit more for the right plant, the right way. You can't buy many of them, that's fine, but less is sometimes more. And those plants also sell seed. You're basically kind of creating this. All now. I think it's just a much different mindset.
Good answer. And you can tell who's the salesman.
Yeah, we do landscape, I think.
But also, if you want to buy trees, and Rob touched on this a little bit, we do large trees. B&B is what we call them. That just means field dug. So if you do want like a larger tree initially, you can buy it. Something that looks a little like this. So these are bur oaks. This is about 14 years in. So you could be saving yourselves 14 years where you don't have to be so patient. You got a big tree. We offer that install.
Good luck with this. Like not a lot of other stuff.
Well, I'd have to get like an actual soil profile. If you've ever had a test done, mostly rocks.
That's bitter.
Yeah, so your soil test comes back and it says what soil? So we do have a couple different rock garden plants that you could try. Is that what the birch is, by the way? Your soil?
No, it's up further, it's all the soil around.
Yeah, like almost like a gravel bank.
All right.
Yep.
But not as rocky. But where that first, but look right on the shoreline, there's a lot of rock, I think. Put them there.
Yeah, so what you're looking for is plants that are on a xeric list. So if you want to write down the word xeric, a lot of times you can find plants that are really tolerant of incredibly rocky conditions. Plants I would suggest to you that we sell, very wild petunia might be one to try. That one's tolerant of really super dry conditions. And Campanula rotundifolia, that's another really nice small plant that tolerates rock. I would say prickly pear cactus if you're getting really extreme on me. And a lot of the liatris actually are very tolerant. So I think maybe at the back of this book, we have a list of plants that like dry. You can look at that for some more inspiration. The xeric list, it's XERIC. Could you use it in a sentence?
one. Happy to. All the plans,
Who are you working with? Lori? Yeah, Lori's right. Yeah, we've got a pretty good team at Johnson's. We've got like the propagator making this stuff, and then we've got artists like Lori that know how to make it all happen.
then.
What it came probably out of MR40.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of invasion. Coordinators and stuff on the data. Lists that are in there.
So, but they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if you're working with these guys, I wouldn't worry about it. I think they're very good about, not using that. But, it's worthwhile, especially if you're sourcing something like out of state. There's different laws and everything about what's located in it, what's not, so it is worth.
Yeah. Yeah, always work with like a local who really knows what they're talking about. And like, you're trying to plant these plants to like improve your surroundings with a lot of different facets. With shading northern pike and like taking nutrients out of our lawns before they hit the water. We're creating shade. We're trying to do all these different things. You might as well get something that's really gonna add every facet of possible value. And it gets down to like pretty nitty gritty details from my experience. Like I can walk along Milwaukee County parks and see where they bought our oaks from Johnson's nursery, where they bought in someone else's oaks. And you can tell, like, even the acorns, even if the plants are surviving, they're both surviving great, growing great. Our acorns are ripening at the right time, falling down and feeding squirrels and blue jays. And I look at this other oak and the bark is a little different, but it's surviving, doing well. But the acorns are huge, they're like this, and they're bright green in November. So they've been frozen, they're not ripe, they're not gonna serve any value to rot.
All the tree has to be, give you take.
Probably have to be like 25 years old before they make a decent crop. Sometimes we'll get them a little bit earlier in small amounts.
Hard money. And you're probably got them
Like this picture here.
like that.
Yeah, so if they're about this big, then I would imagine they're maybe 10 years away. Make sure to take my email and tell me if it works. But, so you just want to be really careful because bur oak on the list doesn't just mean bur oak. You have to make sure you're getting the right bur oak. Otherwise, you just have a shade tree and you're not feeding it. So that was kind of it for my presentation. Thank you.
We appreciate the lively conversation. Nice presentation, Ben. Very interesting. Thought I knew enough about the trees and shrubs, and Washington County does have a tree and shrub sale that we sell every year, and you can still order until March 3rd or 4th, whenever it is on a Friday in March. So we still have a lot of trees yet available, and some of the ones I looked at are shrubs, and it's like, hey, we have Silky Dogwood this year, and we kind of rotate out the types of trees and stuff that we have in there. So that is one of them. Yes, yep. Find a neighbor to go in with split hats. It's about the best I can tell you, unfortunately, but yeah. So, again, my name is Paul Sebo. I'm the Conservation and Zoning Manager for most of my career, 30-some years. I was the county conservationist. And started out the county as a technician and worked my way up to manage the conservation department. Then about 3 years ago, zoning manager retired, the guy in charge of land use, and they said, well, Paul, you can also manage land use inspectors. So I also got sanitation and zoning and learning a lot about shoreline zoning. And I'm not going to defend the shoreline zoning codes. I can just only tell you what's written in the codes and how we got to where we are today. Lynn did a great job of explaining kind of the science behind why we have shoreline zoning in the county. Even in the state for that matter, and why the distances and the setbacks for structures and everything else are there. But obviously, there's politics that involve in a lot of decisions and things that happen in laws. And things get morphed and added on, and changed throughout the years. So it's a never ending changing process that we go through. So, basically the shoreline zoning, covers everything 300 feet from the ordinary high water mark of a stream, 1,000 feet from a lake or pond or flowage, or the outer edge of the floodplain. So what does that really mean? The outer edge of the floodplain? Well, this is a great example. We actually have Big Cedar Lake on the left, Little Cedar Lake on the right. You can still see Cedar Creek that goes between the two lakes. So here you have the 1,000-foot shoreline zone line. Here you have the 300-foot from the stream. And down here is where the floodplain is. So then the shoreline actually also goes out the outer edge of where that floodplain is. So it's a combination of the three different conditions that we have shoreline zoning, and most land disturbances that happen in that actually need a county permit. And this is similar all the way across the state, what things I'm going to talk about. How we actually administer the zoning and the permits is really up to each individual county. So over the years, we've dwarfed into three different type of permits. We have zoning permits that basically cover things that go from 450 square feet of disturbance up to 2,000. They're fairly small projects. They're small permit fees. We have $100 permit fee. The only kind of difference is structures. If you want to put up a structure, you have to go to the town, get a building permit. You come to us, you probably still need a zoning permit because land disturbance, and a lot of times if you're going to put a structure up, you're going to be disturbing enough soil to cover that 450 square feet. Then administrative permits go from 2,000 square feet up to 15,000 square feet. Those are a little more involved, definitely, a lot of silt fence, a lot of construction site erosion control that goes on. There's also a lot of caveats that I didn't get into a lot of details. I could spend probably an hour in all the details of the specific shoreline zoning, regulations and stuff that are out there. But this is kind of the language. We're actually going to amend the code. Here we're proposing in the next month. And this will be the limits. Right now, they actually have limits on steepness. If you're disturbing, on a 15% grade or more than 1,000 square feet, you need a permit. And we're just saying, we don't care how steep it is. If you're disturbing this, you need a permit. The steepness doesn't really matter. It's still the time that's involved and what kind of triggers the projects. Then conditional use permits, like any other conditional use permit, they actually kick in the public notices and notifying neighbors and everything else. That's 15,000 square feet or more. At the county level, my managers or my supervisors basically said, hey, we even need to bring conditional use permits to the county for committee meetings and stuff. So they're actually asking us to loosen up that regulation. So we're looking at moving that up to an acre. The only difference is you bring it to a committee, the committee looks at it and says, yeah, we approve it or not. What are the conditions that staff put on the permit? And it's usually take all staff recommendations to make sure they follow their erosion control plan, make sure they have all the other permit requirements and stuff like that. So that one's going to be probably moved up to 1 acre here in the future, but it's still pending approval yet. Lynn kind of showed this. This was in her poster that she had out there. It is the shoreline zoning and structure setback is 75 feet. So that's any new structure that wants to go into a lot has to be 75 feet away. Again, there's some rare exceptions. You're allowed minor structures, which are 200 square feet or smaller within that 75 foot. But if your structure is already there, it's already within that 75 feet. By code, you can keep what you have, you can maintain what you have, you can maintaining is also meaning improvements. So you have a house within that, windows, you can do interior work, you can do everything else. You just can't expand it closer to the lake. There's limits on lateral expansions. And if you're beyond 75 feet, let's say your house splits that 75-foot line, you can expand that house beyond the 75 feet all you want. Access and viewing corridor. So Lynn showed this kind of the same picture. This is based on a 100-foot wide lot. You're allowed a 35-foot viewing corridor, which means you could take and mow all the grass down or mow all the vegetation down and just leave lawn so you can see the lake. this is definitely one of the things that's proposed in the code. It actually came out of, 2021, budget amendment, which they throw in the budget amendment, the state legislature. They would say two things you never want to see made is hot dogs and laws. These are both kind of scary what goes into them, but they actually they've changed the rule already, which we're supposed to permit by. Is that now a clearing is, this was the old rule. 35 feet and 100-foot wide lot, or 35%, but still the maximum is 35 feet. And now they said, well, if you have a much wider lot, you can actually go up to 200 feet as long as you get that 35%. So if you have somebody that owns 1,000 foot of frontage, 35% could be, 350, but they're maximized out at 200. So that's one of the things that, the state legislators and everybody else kinds of throws their input on, and they create a bill and it gets through and gets passed. Some of the things that I didn't want to go into and bore you, because I felt we're at a native shoreline workshop, but just to know, if you're going to do some landscape work in the shoreline, you're probably going to need a permit from us. They said anything 450 square feet or larger. I said some of the things I didn't touch on is you're allowed a 60-inch wide access path down to the lake edge. You're allowed a boathouse that you can put down on the water edge. That should all be in that viewing corridor. But really it's kind of that buffer strip area that's on there. This 35 feet. Really looking at, when kind of explaining, add vegetation, add additional things to the landscape to improve the water quality that's there. A lot of the shoreline code, like I mentioned, you can keep what you have, but we're always looking to ways to make improvements. So even if you want to do a minor structure that 200 square foot or less, a portion of a buffer has got to be created. So somebody that wants to put a patio or wants to put a fire ring down there with a patio around it to sit chairs, then they have to add in a buffer strip. So they go from lawn to starting to see some of the natives, and it's a great presentation by Ben of what things you could look at. It's nice to know that there's still, if you want to maintain your view, there's a lot of low growing plants and stuff out there that you can use, or anything else that you want to go. So again, it's that corridor strip that you're allowed. That's where all the recreation and traffic and stuff can go. Everything outside of that, it's ideal, and especially that 35 feet from the shoreline back to really try to incorporate natives or try to incorporate something besides lawn where you don't have to fertilize, you don't have to add nutrients. So layout and design considerations. So obviously, either you take a sheet of paper, you take a picture. I actually utilized Johnson's Nursery a couple years ago. Built a house in 2010. We took a picture of our front of our house, brought it down there on the design build, showed the pictures. We never did a site visit. And they're like, oh yeah. And Lori was who we worked with, and here's your plan. And I'm down the store, and I said, that's what we're gonna buy. And we went and planned it all in. It looks great. So I'm very happy with that, the process that they have. So I don't have really a lot of design layout stuff to give recommendations. I'll talk about a few things. They're obviously all very obvious. If you have flow that's going from your house down to the water's edge, try to intercept that flow as much as possible. Try to funnelize it into the native areas. Don't funnel it into the 35-foot wide viewing corridor if you can. Keep it going outside of that. And even kind of like the image on the right. It's a little bit that can be done that can make really kind of a big difference on the view of your house, the view that you have for the lake, and water quality improvements that can be made. A lot of things that Lynn touched on. So I just went through some little pictures and stuff that we had around the office and tried to show examples. And I think that's really kind of the best. You've heard a lot of things that Ben talked about, the different plants and different heights. So just to give you some ideas, it doesn't have to be a full 35-foot wide buffer. It can be islands. It could be anything. But this is the type where I want to show that it's like, okay, the best really for this island is try to sink that down. Try to create your own little rain garden. Rain garden doesn't have to be a great connection from your roof gutter into a rain garden. They can just be a little spot in your yard where you're trapping water, you're infiltrating, instead of sending in things to the lake shore. Even Ben had a little picture of a rain garden with he had a tamarack in there and other things. And it still allows plenty of access and walking paths and stuff to the water. You can see in between their paths to mow and be able to maintain the vegetation patches. There's another one, just be a little creative on how you make it. Nothing has to be square. where I was helping a friend plant trees and in the middle of the field, he was planting trees closer and closer as it started to get things going. He's like, the woods is always thicker in the middle. And it's like, well, it's almost the opposite. The woods is thickest on the outside, not in the middle. But, so. Yeah, just use creativity, work with a landscaper, find the plants that do the best. You said you've heard a bunch of stuff from Ben, really great comments and different things you could already incorporate into it. There's one with a little bit different walkway. It's trying to maximize the amount of infiltration, that you have around the walkway. It's just some big flagstone. After I was thinking about this and looking at my slides earlier today, I did run across a picture that actually has the coconut logs along the lake shore instead of riprap. Coconut logs, they come in about 2-foot diameter. You can stack them on top of each other, stake them into the ground. You can plant into them. They can do really good instead of actually rock themselves. I don't know about the super big waves from some of the wave boats, wake boats and stuff that are out there, if they would really hold up, but a lot of the smaller lakes, they would do just fine. I would believe that KSI out of Waukesha, there's a company. A lot of the companies where you find erosion mat, start researching erosion mat or research coconut logs, shoreline stabilization. Be able to get those. I'd have to run to Waukesha for the company to pick them up or somewhere. Else your contractor, you have a contractor install them. Even here, there's a different one on the right. It's kind of the same picture. One is always from the lake shore, and one is kind of from the side. They have their little path to get down, track path to get around, be able to maintain, to do some pruning, to do some cleanup, the brush and shrubbery. Be able to get down to the water's edge. See a variety of heights and plants and stuff that are in there. Kind of helps to divert that shoreline, kind of create things a little more natural rather than square looking.
Right after it was done. Go together. So people.
Yeah, I mean, all these plants are really got staff in the office, that they follow up like a year later after it's done. So I'd imagine these are a year after, especially this one, kind of looks like the mulch out there. The bark mulch is a little gray already, it's not the right color that would put down there. A little bit more unique about using flagstone. It just kind of helps offer infiltration in amongst your patio and your paving and stuff that you go down. Just how to highlight the edges of it and kind of change up that slope, change up the grade, change up the look. There's a little bit more unique, and we probably see this a lot of our lakes is we have a lot of steep grades that are getting down where they actually took their walking path and rather than steps. So if it was easier by carts or whatever else to get things down the water's edge. So they zigzag down the hillside and basically made islands and stuff in between. Anybody that deals with shoreline zoning, they know in that 2016 rule and change that retaining walls are considered a structure. They have to be 75 feet back unless there's a need. In this case, you have a steep bank. So we can't do much in a lot of cases with steep banks and still be able to access the shoreline. So a lot of property rights, you still have the property, you still be able to get to the shoreline, Black Lake property, it's expensive. So those structures, retaining walls would have to go through a board of adjustment to get approval, but to show the hardship and unique circumstances of the property, especially on super steep hills and banks and stuff like that, retaining walls would probably be approved. This one I included in because this was a technician tour I went on many years ago, just to kind of show it. Doesn't look like much. It's up north. It's in a pine forest. But if you really start to look, they did a lot of this undulation. Dug out this area, flipped it over just to kind of create pockets all the way along the hillside for the water as it goes down the hill. It captured and trapped the little pockets as you go down, just to help trap any runoff, try to infiltrate it, try to do the best you can with the rain, what you have, and either little islands, little areas that are either river shaped. Put some native plantings, or even if you wanted to mow it, you could even just mow through those spots and just a little undulation in the landscape. It can do so much more. think Ben even said it too, something is better than nothing, you know? This is what we're gonna try to avoid as much as possible, is just all this lawn. I don't think Lynn mentioned it. I've heard Lynn present once before. But a shoreline like this, where you're mowing right up to the grass, geese love this. They love walking up on the lawn because there's nothing in their way. There's nothing to hide predators. Some of the best things you do if you have a lot of geese coming up, put a native shoreline, get some stuff that's thick, even 10 feet away from the water's edge. They think there are predators in there. There's times of the year, obviously, geese can't fly, so they have to get from the water up to the shoreline, so they have to get through. But when it's that time, they're gonna utilize a thick shoreline to try to get through a potential predator, and the neighbor has this, and but the neighbor has all the geese poop and everything else that goes along, so. That's all I have. Here's contact information, phone number. Definitely appreciate you all showing up, sitting with us. Thanks, Ben. I don't know if Lynn's still on the phone, but thanks to Lynn for her talk. If you have any questions about Shoreline Zone, I can take those here. I can take them offline. Yeah.
So,
Dave.
Paul, I sent you this picture of,
Yep.
that I just took, last week. And, soon if they did not take the permit out for this. And right here, all the people here are pretty much required.
Right.
And,
Notice that.
So, no, it would have been great to have a seminar for landscape people to log for a life to do. Probably enough logging that almost. And, from wall to wall. And, well, that's one thing, and I know you, take someone to let you know that it's happening. Or you know that it's happening, not but it's and takes out the permit.
Right.
Right. Boathouses, basically, are really not taking on water.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that, for the county took them over and before the state kind of said, yeah, in town was then. That was. That, and mitigation. Like utility ponds or.
So the only places in the code that require mitigation is the minor structures, that 200 square feet of open area. You can have like gazebo style, you can't put walls and stuff around, but if you want to add 200 square feet of a structure from 75 feet down to 35 feet, you're not supposed to put anything from 35 to the water's edge. But if you put in that minor structure, you need to plant a buffer, and it's 70% of the half of the setback, so it's basically like 17 and a half feet back outside your viewing corridor, because you're always allowed your viewing corridor. So that's a buffer requirement. That's kind of a set of mitigation. It just requires a buffer. The only other places that there's mitigation in the code is if you go over your 30% impervious, if you're in a urbanized lake, along the shoreline or other places of the county where you're over 15%. Then you have to mitigate the stormwater impacts. So it's rain gardens, it's other types of native plantings and stuff that we're looking at changing. Or if you want to actually relocate a structure on the property that's closer than 75 feet, you're able to kind of move that structure around. Lateral expansion you could do, but that also requires mitigation of some type. But that's the only places that it's required, so. Yeah.
We'll talk about that. Fall, wall, these. You talked about permitting, is it normal process they building down first?
So typically, everybody that wants to do a building knows they have to go to the town to get a building permit. So the town always says you have to go to the town to get a sign off. Make sure that you're not in a shoreline zone, or making sure you're not needing or upgrading your septic system or anything else. So they come to us, and if they're in the shoreline zone, it's like, okay, what are you doing? Does it meet the requirements kind of things? Then you need a permit from us. If it's all interior kind of work or replacing windows, then it's no permit from us, but if it's exterior work and exterior grading, permit from us, and then the town usually doesn't issue a permit until we say that we're issuing a permit. And then they can go actually get their building permit from the town.
There's another. That I tried. County, from the Netherlands.
And there's,
So that would be, you know. First, you found out for the town.
right, and we do, I mean, we say, here's your permit, now you can go back to the town and get any town permits and stuff that you need. I mean, the hardest ones are people that just do grading work. You know, cause, it's grading work, I don't need a permit from anybody, I'm just either adding a driveway or, you know, reshape my lawn and stuff like that. So there's no town permit typically, if you're in the shoreline zone, you need a county permit from the shoreline zone standpoint. So that's usually the biggest ones we end up finding, and a lot of complaints is, hey, this guy's doing some landscape work, doing some improvements. Put a fire ring down with the fire, and all of a sudden now he's starting to have brick around the fire ring because they want to set their chairs and not be bothered by mosquitoes. Well, that brick around the fire ring is a minor structure. The fire ring isn't typically kind of not specifically exempt, but statewide, they're just looked at as long as it's a normal fire ring, somewhat portable, somewhat removable, you know, those are allowed to stay. Yeah, there's no good answer to catch everybody. I mean, some people do some things at the
Fine,
start the night.
and contact them.
Yep, yeah, I mean, they pulled out a permit to get their driveway in.
Right.
You know, not to start building the structure or anything else, and they shouldn't be really clearing out the shoreline. You know, it was for the driveway permit coming into a certain distance to where future houses, and the house and everything else has to be 75 feet back. You know, but that is a fairly steep slope, and I don't know if those trees were dead, if they were moving dead and diseased trees, or they were just, so yeah, I mean, right after you sent that, Dave was out in the field, I called Dave and pulled in there and, you know, got the answer of what's going on, and we either told them to stop or.
Within that 75 feet.
So if it's, I mean, if it's a brand new house on a vacant lot, they have to be 75 feet back.
What if there were some like, oh, big house, but there's nothing, no relation to.
Right, so. Guessing you're probably talking about a specific case, but. Right. So there's a couple of things that go into, I mean, every case is different. Anybody that wants to build something, you know, it's like, come into the office, let's talk about your site, see how the codes apply to your case, you know, to your site. I know one spot specifically, there were 2 cabins on the site. 75-foot setback and a 25-foot setback from the road left a 10-foot wide house. So zoning laws wouldn't allow anything. So there you have a hardship, there you have unique circumstances of the property, you know, and as long as no neighbors complain or against public interest, you can go through variances to get both of those. So then in that case, in the code that allows setback averaging. So you look at the residents on each side and say, okay, you have one that's 50 feet, you have one that's 60 feet, your house can be actually at 55 feet. So those cases, we look at what the neighboring lots are, and it's kind of the same thing. It's like, okay, that, because it was a tear down, if we're talking about the same place, it was a tear down of 2 cabins. You know, those cabins were closer than the lake than what the neighbors are, but it's like, okay, now you're limited. You can't go back because you have a town road that's right there, or a public road. So what are we gonna use that's allowed by code? So we looked at the code and says, all right, we're gonna do setback averaging from the 2 neighboring lots, so you're not out in front of the next one, because then all of a sudden you have this creep. So then the next guy, well.
They call them. Before that one down, so their intent always was to tear this one down.
We can't read intent, we can't read mind. You know, it's, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, obviously the zoning code started, you know, back in the 70s. We've had it since the 70s, and we then mentioned 75. Where the state administrative codes and legislation was changed. But that setback averaging and all these things have morphed into the code and continue to change. And now if all of a sudden lake classification comes back, now we'll have to see if the county, if the county decision makers, lawmakers are willing to be more restrictive than, what we had in the past. That's really up to them. Right. Yep. Right, yep, yep. Yeah, Lisa, I can't defend the shoreline code, I can only tell you what's in it.